Hello, guys and gals, me Mudahar, and I've never seen this level of just implosion. Now, obviously, today we're talking about Pirate Software, and normally I wouldn't have followed this up because I feel like the Stop Killing Game stuff was where this kind of whole controversy started. So, for anybody that doesn't know, he had a pretty heavy misrepresentation of an amazing movement that really is meant to preserve all video games. And this is one of those things where, all of this could have been avoided if either a mana gem was used or a simple apology was given, right? Just a simple acknowledgement that, yeah, you know what, I'm an abrasive guy, I messed up, simple as that, move on. Now, because of all this, there's been so much controversy that people have been deep diving into his LinkedIn. We are doing professional audits at this point on an individual to make sure that they are actually the coder that they claim to be. Now, to be fair, Pirate Software is the kind of guy where, even if he says that, I don't really mention that I work for Blizzard.
I was watching a video that was critiquing you for mentioning you work at Blizzard so much. I literally never talk about it. When I worked at Blizzard, I did that for Blizzard. Blizzard, 7 years, yeah. Blizzard. I used to work at Blizzard Entertainment. Used to work at Blizzard Entertainment. You're red team specialist for Blizzard Entertainment. And Blizzard is having worked at Blizzard. I grew up at Blizzard.
He will very quickly remind you, yes, my name is Thor. I work for Blizzard Entertainment, Amazon Game Studios, and the United States Department of Energy. To which I believe the last section here was him just literally being a contractor. But yeah, he apparently did work for Blizzard, and some would look at his LinkedIn profile and say he's probably more of a QA kind of guy. So I guess somebody that tests things out. But, I have read definitely that this man has apparently 20 years worth of experience. Now, 20 years worth of experience, people had started to look more into his game Heartbound. So again, I want to jump in here, not necessarily to dogpile the guy, because I feel like there's a lot of that going on, but I actually wanted to look at his game in earnest and kind of see if, some of his mistakes were really huge when it came to coding, and kind of look at things with more context that I feel other channels are kind of providing. So let's get started with his video game, okay? This is Heartbound. Now, Heartbound is one of two video games of Pirate Software. The other game he made was Champions of Breakfast, which apparently was pretty decently popular, but the big thing is Heartbound. Now, Heartbound is a game that released on the December of 2018, so it's been quite a while since this game has actually been in early access. Now, with an overwhelmingly negative review, just because of all of the controversy recently, I want to start off by saying that if you're going to drop a negative review on a game, drop it on the merits. Don't just drop it because you hate the guy, because review bombing is never actually good. So I decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to at least play the demo. Because there ain't no fucking way that I'm spending $13 on a game that has not materialized in goddamn forever. Now, this game is a title that actually ended up doing something that a lot of indie games do not actually successfully do, which is raise funds. Now, this ended up raising $19,272 as of today, in amongst 684 backers. And if you scroll all the way down, ladies and gentlemen, some of the backers here have actually contributed at least $3,000, where I guess they are going to be a custom character somewhere in this game. So the reason why, again, this is a little important to cover too, is that this is also a project that has, money has been requested for it. And you might imagine that with this successful raising of funds, maybe Jason is going to actually release and complete this game. But it's been many years, and the game is, well, not really all the way to completion. And to give an idea, it's not as if the game is necessarily something that is so overly ambitious. If you ever played something like Undertale, for instance, it's really not that far off from that kind of a visual style, and even from the gameplay that I've played in the demonstration of it, it's a fairly written story. I'm not going to criticize it for that. It's animated really well. The actual, graphical style is pretty decent. The music is nice. The actual encounter that I had, the only gameplay where I actually had to deal with, enemies, was decently fun. There was just a mini-game-based battle system, which I imagine is going to change depending on what I'm actually fighting throughout the course of the story. But for the most part, the actual gameplay is necessarily walking around and talking to characters, occasionally solving puzzles, And again, that one occasional fight, at least in the demo. I'm sure the full game probably has more to do, but the full game is also far from completion. Now, according to Jason, I believe Act 3, also known as Animus, is completely written. But yeah, other than that, it's still just something that is trudging along. Now, to be fair, this is a game written by a solo developer, and I don't believe Jason has full-time staff or even part-time staff that assists him outside of contracts for, I guess, game assets and whatnot. Which again is something that is obviously going to impact the development of a game. When you're the only person developing it and you got to split your time between streams, content creation, and making a video game, generally you're going to pick the one thing that is more financially beneficial for you, which it seems is actually producing content, making streams. I don't know how viable that is in the long term, considering how much goodwill that he's burned on a near daily rate. But if you go back to Heartbound, for instance, some of the feature sets are pretty simple. You follow the main character lore and Baron through their adventure through time and space. There's a unique minigame-based combat system, which he says is reminiscent to WarioWare, and I would tend to agree, given the fact that it really takes a few seconds for you to do. I mean, it's just minigames. It's all it is. You can change the story through exploration and interaction with the world. And this isn't something that I would say is relative to like an immersive sim with emergent gameplay. It's literally just a choose-your-own-adventure book. What's interesting also is, again, there's also ARGs that he's also working on too, and embedding within this game that the community is putting together to solve as well. So it's got a lot of aspects that I think tap into I would say a lot of that online content creation indie game scene. This is something that I'm sure he's passionate about, but the more and more I do look into this, the more it personally feels that Heartbound is something that is very heavily inspired by very popular indie games that have come and pretty much gone. Had this game released, around the same time as the Undertale craze, I think it probably would have made a huge splash. But it's been so many years, and even games like Undertale have kind of moved on. There's newer titles like Deltarune that are coming out and seemingly going to finish their production cycles a lot quicker than what Heartbound will do. So yeah, the demo wasn't anything that I would consider to be overly impressive. It is something that I consider to be fine for the most part. It's a game that obviously somebody has developed, and that sometimes can be the hardest hurdle. Is it something that is, mind-blowing in terms of indie titles? No, it's not something that I'm personally really into. But then again, I wasn't even somebody that was all into Undertale anyways. It's serviceable, it's fine, it's written okay, the gameplay is there. But I really think that it shouldn't take this long, in my personal opinion, to finish a video game like Heartbound. What is the real bottleneck in completing it? Is it just Jason not spending enough time developing this? Well, that would require us to look a little bit deeper into the development cycles, the patch history, and more importantly, the development streams that Jason has where he shows himself, quote-unquote, working on these games.
Now, when it comes to Thor, a lot of you guys may be accustomed to his shorts, for instance. It's actually one of the ways that he blew up on YouTube primarily, okay? For a while, you would probably come across a Pirate Software short, and it would be something about programming, or it would just be MS Paint teaching you some fundamentals about whatever it is that he was yapping on. So one of the things that, I've seen sort of people talk about is apparently he claimed to be like this Bob Ross character of programming, this coding ninja, if you will. And the closest actual clip that I could find was not really him saying that, but him claiming that other people called him that.
People call me the Bob Ross of programming, which I think is a pretty big honor, because I like Bob Ross's stuff. I actually grew up watching Bob Ross. It was always really cool to me to see that he would encourage people to make things even if they weren't that good at it. And we entered a time where people felt more creative and felt more comfortable being creative, even if they weren't doing it for a living. They just did it to have fun, and I liked that a lot. Bob Ross is very cool to me.
So he doesn't claim to be the Bob Ross of programming. However, he is somebody that claims to work primarily at places like Blizzard.
Now, I've seen people even look into, him as a hacker, for instance, and there's been some pretty impressive claims from him, like working for the Department of Energy and hacking nuclear plants, or just power plants, not nuclear plants.
But again, obviously, if you look at his history working at Blizzard Entertainment, he's more of somebody that is a red team or application security engineer, not somebody that does like actual game development and science. In fact, the two fields are very different in that regard for obvious reasons. But obviously, if you look down over here, you can see that he's managed social engineering operations to improve employee awareness. Basically, either telling somebody not to stick USB drives into a computer, unknown USB drives into secure computers or company computers, which you'd be surprised how many people actually do all the goddamn time, and then of course infiltrate and exploit physical access controls, and of course up here where he's like working for this Eagle research group, which I believe lines up with the Department of Energy, maybe as a contractor in this case, penetrations testing, working with sensitive networks, development of custom tools. At the end of the day, he does what he does, but more people have started to look into his code writing practices, and, a lot of people really do have doubts based on how he's writing his game Heartbound, and possibly how he might be handling the world of cybersecurity, because there's a lot of things in coding that obviously when you look at, even if you're not a game developer, you can look at how somebody writes code and sort of see if they're maybe more of a novice or an expert, okay? There's a lot of common mistakes that someone can make. And that's where we're going to be looking into his code. We're going to be looking at how he's been showing Heartbound, which is a game he's been publicly developing. So you can pull some of the stuff from his actual streams if you want to. Now, looking closer into Pirate Software's streams, one development stream from about a year ago where he talks about development streams, you can see that in this 8-hour broadcast, there's actually development that goes on. But of course, a quick cursory glance on the timeline does show that in amongst all of this development, obviously there is a fair amount of other things mixed in. Whether that be viewing his content channel statistics over time, or watching videos on the internet about other games, or even just playing games, or slapping on the MS Paint. There's a lot of stuff that happens on here that wouldn't just be game development. That's fine. That's what a stream is about. I'm not here to criticize the guy for it. But one of the things that you've probably seen picked apart by channels like Coding Jesus, for instance, who's made a fair amount of content covering this individual, and he's definitely been all over the recommendations, you can very easily see that, yes, this is a very lucrative path for some people to go to. But I'm not saying that just because somebody gets viewership, they're suddenly grifting in this entire space. Coding Jesus is a person who self-admittedly has had, I believe, 5 years of C++ experience, and I've only seen him mention that once in a video, which makes me question how much of a C++ developer he is, because usually, you tend to hear about them more than you hear about people who use Arch Linux, but that's just me ribbing around here. He has read a lot of books. I believe he runs a course on getting people to code better. So this is obviously somebody that, is an educator in this field. And one could say, and again, I mentioned this stuff because obviously I have to bring it up for transparency's sake. There is somewhat of, yes, a financial incentive to, I guess, crap down Pirate Software. And that could be same for everyone. But some of the things that he's talked about is obviously stuff that makes sense. So for instance, looking at this segment of code right over here, I believe Heartbound, and I might not be, maybe I'm mistaken, but given the fact that he's developing this, obviously, as you can see on GameMaker, the development for Heartbound began around 2017. So there was a lot of things that Coding Jesus had mentioned in his videos that may not have been applicable depending on when Pirate Software had started developing his video game. Now, nothing stops you as a developer from adding things down the road, but generally, when putting together just this video game, which he clearly has an idea and scope of, obviously Thor, there's going to be inefficiencies in code bases. But one of the code bases that we're looking at over here is this falling particle. Now, there's a lot of numbers that are being dropped in here, and one of the things that you'll tend to see in Pirate Software's code is magic number abuse. Now, magic number abuse is effectively, for anybody that doesn't know, magic numbers are arbitrary values that people put into videos, or people put into code, where the value isn't properly defined. So again, it's just numbers you're putting in, and the reason why it's so bad is as simple as this. Imagine if you're writing a bit of code, right? You write code, and then you stop developing that code for a week or two, and now you come back. Now, would you remember exactly every single variable or entry that you put in, or what every single number means, right? Generally speaking, you have to be pretty descriptive with your code, or at least you have to write it in a way where it's almost like, even if you're a solo dev, imagine you're working in a team all the time. Simply because if no other developer can come in and look at your code and figure out immediately right off the bat what things are, that's an issue. That's a problem. Now, going through obviously some more of his code, when he brings up this, for instance, right, in this node, the object scroll Sheldon talker events. Now, some of the stuff that people also brought up in his code, and also Coding Jesus did too, was the amount of commenting that goes on. And this is what I'm talking about with readable code, right? Again, if you have readable code, you really don't need to have a metric shit ton of comments. Generally speaking, I've only used comments to this extreme degree when I was in high school. Or, you know, just literally just in high school. I remember in high school we had this dog shit training language. It wasn't Pascal, but it started with a P. And if somebody could help me remember it, that would be amazing. But, you know, we did that for one semester. And then, you know, the next semester we moved on to C++. Now, in both those semesters in high school, my teacher taught me the entirety of commenting simply because we had to do it just to know how to do commenting in the future. But the other thing that came out was obviously having readable code. Now, the thing is, if you have readable code, you don't need to put a comment in between every single if-else line, or just any line in general. Where I think, realistically, the biggest nightmare for a lot of people when it comes to looking at Thor's code is global storyline array. Now, global storyline array, from my understanding, is effectively the way the game tracks states, and it tracks, you know, what each decision is made throughout the course of a game. Now, this is where it gets really wild, okay? Obviously, if you're looking at this as a programmer, you might be in a bit of a... You might have your mind blown a little bit. Imagine having to constantly control F and look back on this entire array every single time you want to make a reference or a change, right? And of course, what he's done is he's sort of commented on the right what these things associate to. So for instance, gym, void, closet, middle, these are obviously locations. Could be a little bit more descriptive, but I guess they work in the context of the development. And then of course the actual event, which is in this case whistled at PPP. Whoa buddy, talked at bench presses, told the truth, enter void, Joe's sunglasses, Joe's computer checked. And to the right of it, it's a state number, so 0, 1, and 2, which would be reflected in the code right here. And then of course not yet, truth, and so on and so forth, which would be an explanation for what these numbers mean. Now, the way that it blows my mind is, imagine if down the road in the code you miswrote one number for another by mistake. It can happen. The other thing is, obviously, this is built into the game. And one of the things I heard Coding Jesus and a whole bunch of other people mention was that you could use something like a YAML or an XML. But this is where I wanted to provide some of the context, because I think that the version of GameMaker that Thor is using to develop this game, that version, I think at the time, didn't support any form of parsing or JSON parsing or anything of that nature. So I guess his method had to be like coded in. Now, could he change this down the road? Sure. And to give you context, right? Like, again, you don't want this coded in to the game. You want it referring to like JSONs, YAMLs, XMLs, any of that nature. You want it outside the game simply because this just wastes development time, from my understanding. Just like, obviously, you know, you got to build the game, especially when you hard code these things in. I don't think that Jason is some expert coder, and that's totally fine. Nobody has to be John Carmack. Not every single game developer is fucking John Carmack. Not every single, you know, security researcher is a complete expert. I think the best kind of coders that I've ever seen are the ones that understand human limitations and are just good at picking up great concepts. The thing about what I've seen over here is, magic numbers abuse aside, this global storyline array always hits me as just bad coding practice. And the thing is, a lot of this leads to what we call tech debt. So the more tech debt you acquire, meaning that, you know, the more bad practices you make in the beginning, all snowball down the road, and makes it so that, you know, down the road when you're fixing up your game, when you're bug fixing, when you're tracing an error, when you're tracing something, you know, that is going wrong in one function, you are wasting so much time because your code is so poorly written that, you know, something that could probably take you, you know, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe an hour to fix may actually take you days to fix. Maybe it's something that is so confusing that you probably don't want to go all the way back and fix things. And for Jason's sake, it's not so much a situation where he can just I guess, maybe gut the code and redo it from the beginning. It really is just a bad practice that has manifested itself into what we're seeing over here. Now, Coding Jesus even brought in a game maker developer who showcased a performant lighting engine versus the version that, Jason had in his game. Now, of course, this version, this 2D ray casting that he had, was apparently so imperformant that it was doing tens of thousands of checks. And again, a lot of this was being done on the CPU, which, if you've ever noticed how this stuff is done, there's a reason why we have graphic processing units, which would calculate a lot of this stuff in parallel, calculations. Not something that you would really want to put onto the CPU. But again, in this case, I want to talk a little bit about context. Obviously, the engine that, Pirate Software is using, Game Maker, and the resolution he's running the game on functionally really makes it so that, again, I was playing this on a handheld Steam Deck, the demo at least, and on my main computer. And for the most part, it actually runs pretty well at 60 frames per second. So even if his code is inefficient, for instance, it's still functional enough to do the job that it was set out to do. A lot of the stuff that people have been brought up and scrutinized him for is making imperformant code, which is totally a valid concern, and it's totally valid to call out somebody that claims to have decades of experience for basically writing code as if, he was in high school or, very, very first year college, if that even, or, not even working professionally. Working professionally, anyone would have picked up and yelled at you for how poorly some of this code was written initially. He kind of writes these video games, and the best way to kind of say it is he writes it like a true, honest indie developer, somebody who's first time developing a video game, somebody who may not even have programming knowledge. And this is where, obviously, if you really want to look at bad code, there's a lot of really popular games that are written in a dogshit manner. Games like Undertale, for instance. Toby Fox, apparently famously, has probably one of the longest switch statements when it comes to the dialogue. I believe the whole game's fucking dialogue is an entire switch statement. It's just spaghetti code. But nowhere has Toby Fox claimed to work for 2 decades, in the world of red team hacking at Blizzard, so on and so forth. That's just somebody that is very upfront and honest. They're not a programmer. They're just somebody that wanted to make a video game, and they made one of the best games of all time. From what I understand, even games like Celeste, one of the best platformers in the world, actually tends to have, I believe, like a 5,000 long class file just with its movement. So again, no game developer in this space, especially an indie game developer, is perfect. And if we're going to be judging somebody for bad code, there's a lot of indie games with bad code. Hell, for crying out loud, if fucking Bethesda can release games like Fallout 3, Oblivion, even Skyrim, especially on the goddamn PlayStation 3, and charge money for that, that's a big AAA company releasing dogshit code at times, heavily relying on the community to fix it. Again, a lot of the anger comes to Pirate Software because of his ego. Because even if you call him out on this stuff, he'll always have some bullshit answer to hit you back with. For instance, even going to the lighting engine that was mentioned over here, Pirate Software goes out and gives one of the most nonsense responses. So obviously he says, I chose to do pixel by pixel CPU based lighting over using a shader to ensure the system was compatible with machines that could not compile shaders. This was helpful for a number of regions such as Brazil, where the game has been very popular. And this is where it's so difficult to even defend, because it's a simple way of him saying, yeah, the code's just not efficient. Even when there's another game maker developer, in that Coding Jesus video that came out and basically provided a better, more performant option. Maybe he wrote this as a way that he thought in his head, this is how you do it, okay? When I was like, again, I keep going back to like high school, even college, and sometimes you do something because in your mind, that's how you write code. And then, of course, some senior comes by and says, yeah, you could have done this in a much more efficient way. It's one of the reasons why your program is probably consuming more resources than you could imagine, right? Yes, in this case, for his Heartbound, this lighting engine may have been functional because of a low resolution overall, but nothing, stops you from making more efficient code down the road. And you could say yes, for Jason's game, it's probably good enough. But the thing is, people look at it, from a perspective of him being this, good coder that I guess has sort of been sort of passed on as, people look into his past and they're like, all right, somebody with this much experience should know how to do this thing better. And again, he could literally just say, yeah, it's wrong, but instead he comes with this long diatribe, talks about CPU rendering, and this whole thing about Brazilians, right, being like assisted because he's using this software solution to prevent, I believe, shader calculations to happen. As if people all over the world, even in the more poorer countries, have access to even the weakest GPUs that are DirectX 11 capable, even basic GPUs with shader calculation. From my understanding, even the engine he's using, Game Maker, requires a hardware accelerated GPU setup, whether that be integrated, whether that be not. The concept of shader calculation would just be a required thing anyways, whether or not you're using it. So he could come with more performant options. He could come with more performant code. But this is just him, again, not simply saying, yeah, I made a little oopsie. Maybe it's not as good as it should be. But all he could even just say is it doesn't have to be as good. It just works for my project, and it works on every system. That's really the best answer you could give.
The lighting, when used correctly, increases CPU usage over baseline a negligible amount and runs on both a smart fridge, which it doesn't. He's referring to a video that somebody made where they apparently ported his game to a smart fridge, even though he's not even being truthful about it. They just casted the games over to a smart fridge using something known as Smart View. So it's kind of like saying, hey man, this Apple TV of mine can run Cyberpunk 2077 with full path tracing enabled. Also the caveat, the game is being streamed from an RTX 4090 enabled computer. Yeah, no shit, the smart fridge can run a casted video. Come on now. What they did is like driving a manual, not knowing how to use a clutch, and then blaming the car.
Yeah, I don't know what he's talking about, Pirate. What do you mean manual car? That analogy doesn't even make any sense.
I don't know how this fucking relates to coding whatsoever. I don't know what he was trying to go with here. I'm still trying to process the statement, but it is what it is. So then he says, for context, all of this was written in Game Maker Studio 1.4 back in 2018. A massive number of modern features in Game Maker did not exist then. Updating this now would give trivial benefits to performance without any gameplay improvements. The framework is functional, performant, and shipped. And that's where I do tend to agree with Jason a little bit over here, because yes, he's got the scope of his game in mind. And if it works, right? That's kind of the goal in general. If we want to sit here and basically, call him out for being so bad in terms of coding, that's a whole different story. And in some cases, it has merits. The guy has pretty much been showcasing his credentials like crazy. And if we're looking at it from a programming angle, the way that he's written this code is not reflective of a man with so much perceived credentials. So doing all this off decompiled code and proudly displaying it is dubious at best, which I guess is kind of true. But given some of the tools used to decompile, I don't think that there's such a massive difference in the code that he used as source and what was effectively decompiled. But again, I'll let the actual expert, in Game Maker correct me on that if you need to. So I've been releasing monthly updates for Heartbound since January. All these can be seen in the Steam announcements on the game's page. So yeah, when he says this, it's kind of true, but let me show you the amount of effort that's been going on into this entire project. So for instance, Heartbound's Steam database right over here is quite honestly the most important part. So if we go to the patches on SteamDB, you can see that, yes, when the game was being developed in June, for instance, and then it was developed a bit in March, right? So for instance, in June in 2022, all the work effectively happened in the course of this month. Then, of course, 2023 came around where he had one big patch in March, one patch in June, one patch in August. So yes, there was monthly work being done. And then, of course, September, and then October, and then with November skipped, he did do December. And of course, there was a couple months skipped in 2025. Actually, all of 2024 was effectively forgotten. 2025, March 2nd, he actually did patch the game. And I believe this was around the time when people started to kind of call it out on Reddit.
So a patch was pushed out, then another patch in May, and then of course another patch in May again towards the end of the month, and then in July. So to say that every single month kind of gets a patch is not entirely true, I would say. But he has, I guess, been working on this game. And you can open up these patch notes and see what he's been doing. You know, he'll add new content, he'll do bug fixes, so on and so forth. Now, it is kind of understood, I guess, by most people that it really seems like for him, most of the money is in streaming nowadays. Most of the money is basically in this community that has blown up. And for other context's sake too, there was a period, again, like I said, where he almost did die apparently through COVID, his words. So if there is a gap in, I guess, updates, it most likely is just attributed to the fact that he was sick, he was going through personal stuff, and he is just a solo developer on this. So again, with somebody that has to juggle, again, a massive following on the internet, and of course, an entire indie game, I'm sure that, again, it's logical that he's probably going to favor what makes most of the money anyways. But that's still no excuse. You did charge money for this game, you still are charging money for this game, and again, you should finish this game. But I'll get back to that towards the tail end. You know, a lot of people compare his code with Yandere Simulator, but I think I'm going to go as far and say that maybe in this situation, what Yandere Simulator is definitely much more of an impressive game. Now, a lot of people have shit on Yandere's dev, quite a fair bit for a lot of reasons. But when it comes to his code, you know, a lot of his code was laughed at because this is one of the things from 9 years ago. People looked at his crazy if-else statements, right? And of course, obviously, according to Yandere dev, he did switch this off to actual switch statements. Not that it necessarily makes it much better, but if it's one thing that I do appreciate a little bit more about Yandere dev's code is just looking at his code versus, you know, Thor's code. I would say that his code is more readable in the sense that I could look at this function and look at this set of code and understand just from reading everything about this, what it's about, what it's referring to, and what values it's going at. And while, yes, there are some levels of magic numbers, I would say that it's crazy to think that Yandere dev has a little bit more readable of code, in my opinion at least, than global storyline array yada 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 yada. Now, does that make Yandere dev a better programmer? I don't know. Maybe not, but he's not a hard bar to fucking go past, okay? Let's be completely real here. But there's a big difference between, again, Yandere dev and a big difference between Thor. Yandere dev, I don't believe ever claimed to be this crazy super hacker, somebody that is a computer aficionado. And, you know, on the other hand, you've got Mr. Egotistical, who has 20 years of whatever goddamn experience, so on and so forth. It's that reason alone that people have speculated and people have looked so hard into his code and audited so much of his life. Because again, it used to be that, I guess, programmers really weren't looking that too deep into it. But now it's like people are looking at these basic mistakes and making pretty reasonable conclusions that maybe this guy isn't the hottest, you know, fucking shit in the room. So there was a lot of people even looking into like things like his DRM, for instance, and this is where a lot of stuff tends to get into like really big misinformation territory. Now, again, with this stance on stop killing games, and again, somebody that really doesn't seem like they care about game preservation, a lot of people looked at even his game Heartbound, and there was misinformation, like apparently his game was online only, which it wasn't. There was a lot of people spreading misinformation that apparently his game checked the Steam achievements and verified the game's validity through that, even though that was something that belonged in his prior game, Breakfast of Champions. Again, with Heartbound, the game is entirely playable offline. The only thing that it does do is check for online and offline in Steam mode. In fact, it's actually quite easy to beat the DRM for something like Heartbound. And of course, there's repacks and plenty of people that have beaten it. There actually really isn't even a deterrent. There actually really isn't even a big DRM to this game. In fact, if anything, it might be one of the lightest deterrents that I've actually ever seen for a video game. Now look, at the end of all this, ladies and gentlemen, I think there's been a huge dogpile on, you know, Thor. I think there has been, right? Simple as that. And I don't want to just be somebody that contributes to it for the sake of contributing to it. I really do feel like, you know, at the end of all this all could have been avoided, okay? All Pirate Software had to do was either use the fucking mana gem, okay? Or if he fucked up in World of Warcraft, You know, instead of being the biggest douche in the fucking room and effectively being the person with the largest ego on all of planet Earth, I mean, we are talking crazy levels of ego, crazy levels of pompousness. If he had just simply learned to shut the fuck up and apologize, even if you don't mean it, just learn to take a little bit of an L. Learn to laugh at yourself. None of this would have been an issue. The guy would have still been a beloved content creator, still would have been somebody that was pretty squeaky clean of any controversy. Instead, ego became the reason why he effectively is a lightning rod of controversy all over the internet. Everyone and their mother is taking a fucking shit down his throat. And again, it's hard to root for Pirate Software. It's hard to even be aligned with him because he makes it so easy to absolutely despise himself. He has the ego of somebody that apparently through his own code and through his own actions has not proven to be worthy of that ego, okay? This is not John Carmack we're talking about when it comes to developing video games. And while he, granted, has never admitted to that and he's never claimed to be the greatest programmer in the world, it's just somebody that has coasted on this 20 years of Blizzard experience, red team specialization, and when you look at how he codes a video game, it makes you really question everything you've ever gotten from him. Now again, to go further into Pirate Software, I think the best way for him to honestly come out of this is, again, learning when to shut the fuck up, learning to take an L. But one thing that I have learned in doing this whole video and researching everything here is that I really do think that he does genuinely care about this game, Heartbound. And I really think the best way to turn around this bad luck and this bad fucking like controversy that he's gone through is just finish the game. I really do think that, you know, if he puts his mind to it, with technical debt all the way provided here, he could still finish this game. It is definitely an uphill battle. I do think that looking over at his code and looking how he's done this game, I don't think that it's going to be an easy thing down the road. But he's got a game, he's got a scope, he knows what this game is supposed to be and what it's not. And for a solo developer, I still think that he can cross the finish line and make this RPG a true thing. You know, even if at the surface level, it feels like a game that is kind of cashing off of the success of something like Undertale, I think for anybody that has put years upon of his life into an entire project like this, he definitely wants to see it finished. And I think the best thing you can do is to just finish this project, to have it completely behind you, to release something in a 1.0 state, and again, to give the backers who gave you money, in some cases $1,000 even, one person, just give them the game that they paid for. Finish your project and then move on to something else. Because ultimately, you know, this is somebody that keeps feeding into the drama. He keeps calling everybody else a grifter. He keeps trying to be the person that is always 100% right. Unfortunately, you're not 100% right, bro. You're somebody that is constantly feeding into this nonsense drama. You're somebody that is constantly not focusing on this game, it seems. You're somebody that is putting way too much effort into playing random video games, watching videos, constantly responding to things that really don't even really need a response. There is a time and place where you kind of lower your head down, even if you're facing intense adversity, and just finish these projects, because that really is the best way to win against it. Now, again, when I talk about this dog pile, I really feel like, obviously, for me, a lot of sympathy comes from looking at somebody. I have never experienced even 1% of the level of hate that Pirate Software has been getting. And there's very few people that I think end up actually receiving this level of online scrutiny and hatred. And the mental toll that I guess it can take on somebody is pretty massive. Even if your ego is in the fucking stratosphere like Pirate Software's is, I still think all of this online hatred can get to you. And it's one of the reasons why I don't, in this entire video, want to contribute to it. I did want to look at this video. I wanted to give this game an honest review. And I think that while it's not my cup of tea, I can see that there is value in it. I can see that he wants to produce something. And I wish him nothing but the best in that process. When it comes to looking at his code, when it comes to looking at his credentials and all of these things combined together, I tend to see somebody who boasts about being a professional, but I really do feel that everything that I've seen is something of a novice. And again, this wouldn't be that big of a deal. Again, there's nothing wrong with having shit code, right? There's nothing wrong with being bad at it. I'm not a fucking great coder either. But I'm also not claiming to be this crazy fucking guru hacker expert in the world. There's a lot of mistakes that I make. There's a lot of mistakes that people like Coding Jesus make. There's a lot of mistakes that even the best people in this industry, like John Carmack, can make. But again, when you have an ego, you gotta be able to match it with the skill. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that skill is all the way there. Unless that skill is making a whole lot of spaghetti code. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike it if you dislike it. I am out.